So, carrying right on with the theme of the last video, how do we actually respond to the problem of algorithmic governance through filter bubbles? And one method of getting out of this and escaping effects of surveillance and the culture of filter bubbles is to create what we call decentralized networks. Now, traditionally, social media networks work in the model here, which I've got labeled centralized. Sorry about the decentralized on my videos over it a little bit, but at least you can see the image. A centralized network is where the nodes of the network, that is us, feed into one core. That is the software. So we take Facebook for an example. Facebook is the core, right? And we are nodes on the edge of that core. A different system that we could have is called a decentralized network, which means that the control of network is at the nodes themselves, i.e. the users, rather than at the center, i.e. the corporation. So therefore, we control what data we give out to other nodes in the network, and we control how we connect to those other nodes in the network too, rather than being in one giant system which is harvesting up all the data for ourselves. Instead, we just connect to individual networks ourselves. So this would give control back to the user effectively. Decentralization has been linked to what we call an idea of a socialist response to social media structure. Instead of having like one company, we all have different companies. We all have our own little company. One strategy of social internet politics is to establish and support non-commercial, non-profit internet platforms. And it's definitely not impossible to create successful non-profit internet platforms. The example of Wikipedia, of course, is a great example of this, which is advertising free, free to access, and is financed by donations, and is free for everyone to use. Now, the most well-known alternative social networking site project is Diaspora, which tried to develop an open source alternative to Facebook, which had much of that model that I just illustrated, the decentralized model. When you got on Diaspora, you didn't join Diaspora because you joined it through a web portal or anything like that. Instead, you downloaded effectively a small little server that sat on your computer, and you ran your Diaspora network from that little node itself. So Diaspora was a project created by 4 New York University students, defined itself as privacy aware, personally controlled, do-it-all, open source social network, not funded by advertising, but by donations instead. So you already cut out the need for large-scale data harvesting, which is to satisfy advertisers if you don't have advertisers. 3 design principles of Diaspora are choice, self-ownership of data, and simplicity. So the Diaspora team was massively critical of control of personal data by corporations, describing Facebook as spying for free. And the basic idea of Diaspora then is to circumvent the corporate mediation of sharing and communication by using decentralized nodes, just in that model that I just showed you. So each person in the network is their own little node on the network, and they control and store their own data and so on and so forth, and they choose what is shared across from their little node on the network. Each user has their own data node that they fully control. So as one of the founders, Zhytomyrsky, I think I always get that name wrong. On Diaspora, users are no longer dependent on corporate networks who want to tell you that sharing and privacy are mutually exclusive. In fact, on Diaspora, they both are one and the other. So Diaspora aims to enable users to share data with others, and at the same time to protect them from corporate domination and from having to sacrifice their data for corporate purposes in order to communicate and share. Diaspora, therefore, can be considered as a socialist internet project that tries to realize a socialist privacy concept itself. And that socialist privacy concept in itself is that we all contribute to this network. We decide, though, what we contribute on an individual basis. There is no corporate control here. There is control by the people on the network itself, hence being socialist. So this is neatly turned into dot communism, and the ideas that inspired the Diaspora team were inspired by the dot communist manifesto of Eben Moglen in 2003. Now, Moglen's argument is that an important political goal and possibility today is the liberation of information from the control of ownership. And with the help of networks that are based on association amongst peers without hierarchical control, which replaces the coercive system of capitalist ownership of knowledge and data. So right in 2003, before Facebook and the like became major players in social media, before this model became ubiquitous, there was an identification of a different way of doing things. In overthrowing the system of private property and ideas, we bring into existence a truly just society in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So really the vision here is of social media as being a tool that can help personal development rather than a tool for exploitation of us by a corporate platform. Whoosh, radical, absolutely radical. And tied up still, again, very, very closely to these ideas of data privacy and personal choice over data and personal control over data, which again are key fundamental aspects of the dark web. So you can see how all these ideas fit together. An alternative to Diaspora was Elo, created by Bunitz and Berger in 2014, an advertising-free alternative to both Facebook and Twitter. Kind of worked as a kind of in-between between the two sites. 3 principles Elo had: never sell user data to advertisers or third parties, never show advertisements, and do not enforce a real name policy. And that one became very, very important, because when Elo launched, the idea of you not being a product became a very important strapline for what they were doing. Never sells data and therefore does not commodify social media usage. In 2014, members of the LGBTQ community in San Francisco left Facebook for Elo in protest at Facebook's real name policy and the effect of exclusion that has on drag queens. So for a brief period of time, Elo became drag queen central, you know, and I'm sure Rue would have been really, really proud of all the queens on Elo going crazy for being able to use the names they wanted to use, which is huge, right? Another alternative was Minds, an open source and distributed social network using blockchain protocols to reward users for participation. They had ERC's 20 tokens, and you were rewarded for actually participating on Minds. Users could use those tokens to exchange, promote content, or crowdfund and tip other users. Minds' whole thing was all about radical transparency and free speech, which meant it did attract a lot of dangerous right-wing psychopaths as well. And as we see, that's become a thing with alternative social media. It was founded in 2011 and exited beta in 2018, is now integrated within the Ethereum e-currency. So blockchain integration and e-currency with radical free speech agendas should lead us to understand what the platform is used for, which is a lot of right-wing garbage and selling things like guns and stuff like that, which is not great. We go further down the right-wing rabbit hole now, and I'll come on to another one in a second. As an alternative to Twitter, Gab has become kind of notorious. It's Twitter-based. It looks a lot like Twitter, known for far-right users, a safe haven basically for neo-Nazis and other right-wing alt-right groups. Now, it operates outside of really advertising, above which it can, not many advertisers are queuing up to go on Gab, and its principles on data are fairly protective, but it is basically an echo chamber for right-wing content dissemination. And just much as Minds became sort of a right-wing lunatic fest, Gab really topped it off, way bigger than that. 465 users in April 2018. It's gone down a fair bit since then. The most used followers were Richard Spencer and Alex Jones. You may not be aware who these guys are, but you can look up a video of Richard Spencer from Trump's inauguration day in 2016. He's the Nazi that gets punched in the side of the head. Alex Jones is a lunatic, known for the InfoWars radio show. He's crazy. What is the influence of Gab? Well, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting of October 2018 shows us what the influence of Gab is. The perpetrator was a Gab user that had a verified account and used that account to spread anti-Semitic abuse. Now, in the aftermath of the shooting, Gab handed over the account information to the FBI, and Gab went down afterwards because GoDaddy removed hosting for the site following the attack. Gab went back online. It found a different server and a different internet provider 2 days later, but it really started to lose a lot of its appeal when it was harboring people who were talking about going to shoot up synagogues and then went and shot up a synagogue. But this kind of discourse is not unusual on websites like Gab. So these alternatives to social media can sometimes be quite disturbing, and what goes on them away from the eyes of social media moderation and content moderation can be extremely disturbing. And what I'm trying to do here is show that whereas we might want changes to be made to social media in terms of privacy, in terms of surveillance, but the alternatives out there which provide those are actually dark and disturbing places where a lot of political ideologies that we would not agree with and that we would find horrendous do get shared without consequence. And if you remove the features the social media has, you have some unintended consequences very often in terms of the kinds of political and social discourses which occur on these platforms. So these decentralized advertising, no data sold, free speech, these are the sites, but they're is associated with very marginal groups in society. They avoid the filter bubble, but they simply create different types of echo chambers like these utter scumbags in Charlottesville in 2017 who would flock to things like Gab and Parler, which is its new one. And I wanted to talk very briefly about Parler. Parler is the successor to Gab in many ways, being used by the remnants of Trump's Republican Party in order to spread their wild conspiracy theory fantasies about stealing elections and so on. Parler's doing great business with the right. In Britain, obviously Katie Hopkins has lost her platforms, but she's now really popular on Parler. It is a nightmare. Now, fortunately, not all social networks, alternative to Facebook, Twitter, etc., are that bad. We have to take into account that there are social networks which operate in completely different cultural contexts as well. Wechat can be, which is a major network in China, probably the most important one in China, and that probably makes it one of the most important in the world, can be categorized as a mobile instant messaging application or chat app. I'm not familiar with chat apps, but Wechat can do so much more than the chat apps that we have in this country. Wechat is a crazy application that means you can run your entire life out of Wechat, basically. It's a mobile technology platform which the primary function is to allow users to send real-time messages to individuals or groups of contacts at no cost via the internet. Since it's founded, it's also added a huge number of other functionalities in it, especially WeChat Pay, which means you can basically conduct everything through WeChat. Lots of things to do with travel and so on. It's got a huge functionality. Now, these chat apps, very important differences between chat apps and social networks when it comes to the nature of the network articulation that they facilitate and the capacity they afford users to traverse connections. So network articulation, as discussed by Dana Boyd and Nicole Ellison in their definition of social networks, entails making one's network visible to those with whom one shares a connection. Chat apps rarely do this. Instead, accessing other users' profiles typically requires some type of direct communication, and WeChat is layering on a lot of functionality, but at root, it's a chat app. A mix of Facebook and Twitter is what WeChat is ending up at. But really, when we talk about things like WhatsApp as social media, if you want to use the context of this, it is performing functions of social media, but it's not traditionally what we call a social media network. That is not to say that companies like Facebook don't see the importance of this. Direct messaging apps, either through Facebook Messenger or through something like WhatsApp, which Facebook purchased, remember, they recognize the importance of these apps within the digital ecostructure. But in terms of social media itself, they are slightly different. And therefore don't really provide the alternative that we're looking for. But in cultural terms, they are extremely important in different cultures. We think WhatsApp is used hugely here. You want to see the statistics around the world. Places like the Philippines, Brazil, it is off the scale usage, things like WhatsApp. So, in different cultural contexts, these applications are incredibly important socially. Now, What's problematic about Chinese social media is that it's even more integrated into surveillance than the Western social networks, because it's integrated into the functioning of the state itself. Even when those applications are used outside of the Great Firewall in China, so when people go abroad and they use WeChat, it is still feeding back to China that data. And, you know, I mean, look, I'm not going to sit here and criticize China in terms of surveillance and privacy, because I've been criticizing Facebook and Twitter and all these companies for this all the way through this module. But we need to recognize that, you know, the integration with the state here in particular is really, really problematic. How does all this fall together? You know, there's really two really short videos, and this is kind of a short lecture set, really. And, you know, they're just some ideas that I'm putting out there that you might want to consider. Really, let's think, though, where this sort of set up. Are there alternatives to social media? The answer is yes, with a huge but. Yes, there are alternatives, but they are really, really difficult to use. You need technological skill to utilize them, and they're often taken over by, not always in a good way, like, you know, with the drag queens in 2014, they're often taken over by really, really dangerous groups of people who want to express their views in this echo chamber and egg one another on into more extreme sort of positions. So they're really, really problematic, these alternatives. So maybe instead of looking for inventing something new, what we should be going for actually is reform of the existing social media and more regulation of it. Alternative social media have emerged. However, they've remained marginal with low numbers. Being outside those monopolies is really hard, but also some of the social and cultural effects of these sites has been quite disturbing. Thank you, guys, and next topic will be love in the digital age. See ya.